He had nothing left. No wife, no home, no name that meant anything to anyone. Just two freezing children in the back of a dying wagon and a winter that wanted all three of them dead. The ranchers slammed their doors in his face one by one, not because he was dangerous, but because he came with kids, and kids meant trouble they couldn't afford. Then he found a ranch, the one everyone said was already finished. This is the story of what happened when a man with nothing met a woman who had everything to lose. Stay with me till the end. You won't regret it. And if stories like this are what you've been looking for, hit that subscribe button and join our family, so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to 1887. The wagon's left rear wheel had been wobbling since somewhere around the Missouri border, and Caleb Thornridge had been listening to it threaten to give out for the better part of 2 days. He didn't fix it. Not because he couldn't. Fixing things was the one talent God had bothered to give him in abundance. But because every time he thought about stopping, he'd hear one of his kids shift in the back, and stopping felt like surrendering to a version of this journey that ended badly for all of them. So he kept the horses moving, kept his eyes on the gray line of horizon ahead, and tried not to think about his wife. That was the hardest part. Not the cold, not the hunger, not even the humiliation of being turned away at ranch after ranch with 2 children watching from the wagon bed. It was the way Margaret's voice still showed up in his head at the worst moments. You'll figure it out, Caleb. You always do. He hadn't figured this one out yet. The children, Thomas, who was 9 and had learned somewhere along the road to stop asking questions, and little Nora, who was 4 and hadn't learned that yet, were buried under every blanket Caleb owned, which was 3. The temperature had been dropping since late afternoon, and the particular kind of cold that came off the Montana plains in early winter wasn't the kind that crept up on you. It hit like a wall. Pa? Thomas's voice came from the back, flat, careful. Nora's asking for milk again. I know. She asked 3 times. I know, Thomas. A pause. Then the boy's voice quieter. We don't got any left, do we? It wasn't really a question. Thomas had stopped asking real questions 2 weeks ago, somewhere around the same time he'd stopped crying at night. Caleb wasn't sure which development worried him more. We'll find some, Caleb said. He said it the way men say things when they're not sure they're true, but can't afford to say anything else. He'd heard about Black Ridge Hollow from a farrier in a town whose name he'd already forgotten. The man had mentioned it the way people mention places they feel sorry for. A ranch out past the Eastern Ridge, been struggling for years. Owner's a widow woman who lost her husband to a riding accident 2 winters back. Most of the valley had written it off. Too isolated. Too beaten down. Land wasn't worth much after the drought years, and the winter that had come before last had taken 3 of her best horses and a significant portion of her cattle. She's still out there, though, the farrier had said, with something between admiration and pity. Don't know why. Pride, maybe? Stubbornness? Hard to tell the difference sometimes. Caleb had filed that away the way he filed away most things. Quietly, practically, without ceremony. Now as the wagon crested a long, wind-scoured ridge and he saw the ranch below for the first time, he understood why people had written it off. It looked like a place that had been fighting a war for a long time and was starting to lose. The main house was solid enough, but the barn sat at an angle that made no architectural sense until you thought about it. Then it made even less sense, because whoever had positioned it had managed to place it at the precise angle that caught the worst of the northwestern wind. The fencing along the eastern pasture had a long section that was bowing outward, not broken, but ready. The water trough nearest the barn was in a position that guaranteed it would freeze solid within 3 days of a real cold snap. There was hay storage that sat low, and low meant wet, and wet meant rot, which meant the cattle would have a problem by February, even if everything else went right. Caleb saw all of this in about 90 seconds. He also saw smoke coming from the chimney of the main house, which meant someone was home and warm, which was the only thing that mattered to him right now. He clicked his tongue at the horses and guided the wagon down the ridge. The woman who opened the door had flour on her hands, and the look of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something and had a well-developed system for deciding, in the first 3 seconds, whether the interruption was worth the trouble. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-30s at most, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that were doing several calculations simultaneously. She looked at him, then past him at the wagon, then at the two small shapes bundled in the back. "Whatever you're selling," she said, "I'm not buying. I'm not selling anything." "Then whatever you need, I probably can't spare it." "Ma'am." Caleb kept his voice level. He'd had this conversation, or variations of it, 6 times in the last 2 weeks. He'd learned to stay calm. Desperation read as threat, and he couldn't afford to be read as a threat. "My youngest needs milk. She's 4 years old, and we've been on the road for 2 days without proper food. I'm not asking for much, just enough to get her through tonight." The woman's eyes went back to the wagon. Nora had poked her head out from under the blankets, apparently deciding this was interesting enough to investigate. She was staring at the woman with the particular unfiltered intensity that 4-year-olds deploy without mercy. Something shifted in the woman's expression. Not softness exactly, more like the practical acknowledgement of a situation that had its own logic. "What else?" she said. Caleb blinked. "Ma'am? You said just enough milk, but you pulled a dying wagon down my ridge instead of going to any of the other ranches between here and town, so there's something else." She looked at him steadily. "What is it?" He hadn't expected her to be that direct. Most people danced around the obvious for a while before arriving at the actual question. "A place to sleep," he said. "For them, mostly. The boy's been good about it, but he's cold and he won't say so, and—" He paused. This was the part that either worked or didn't. "I want to work. I'm not asking for charity. I can see from here that your barn is going to give you serious problems before January. Your water system's going to freeze. You've got hay storage that'll rot. I can fix all of it. I just need somewhere warm to put my kids while I do." The woman stared at him for a long moment. "You can see all that from my doorway," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "In the dark. The positioning of the barn is obvious from the ridge. The rest I'm extrapolating from what I can see and what tends to go wrong with ranches in this kind of terrain." She studied him with the look of someone deciding whether she was looking at a genius or a con man, and acknowledging that sometimes the difference was hard to distinguish up front. "Ilara Whitmore," she said finally. "Caleb Thornridge." "Those children have names?" "Thomas and Nora." She looked at Nora again, who had now emerged almost entirely from the blankets and was examining Ilara with an expression of solemn scientific inquiry. "Bring them inside," Ilara said. She said it the way she probably said most things, not kindly, not unkindly, just directly, as though sentiment was a language she'd learned but didn't speak natively. "I'll get the milk. Then you can tell me what you think is wrong with my barn." The kitchen was warm in a way that hit Caleb physically, like walking into a different world. Thomas climbed down from the wagon without being told and helped Nora down after him, and when they came through the door, the boy stopped and just stood for a moment in the heat, with his eyes closed, and Caleb had to look away. He'd figure it out. He had to. Ilara moved through the kitchen efficiently, pouring milk and setting bread on the table with no particular ceremony. She watched the children eat with an expression Caleb couldn't read. Not maternal, not distant, something between the two. "You said you lost other ranches before this one," she said to him, once Nora had her milk and Thomas was working his way through bread with the focused intensity of a child trying not to look like he's ravenous. "I was turned away from other ranches," Caleb said. "Different thing." "Why?" He kept his voice neutral. "Because I came with children. Most ranches want single men for winter work. Kids mean complications." "And you didn't leave them somewhere?" "No." Ilara poured coffee without asking if he wanted it and set it in front of him. "Why not? Would have been easier." Caleb wrapped both hands around the cup. The heat coming through the tin was almost painful. "Their mother died in April. Fever. Last thing she asked me was to keep them with me." He looked up at Ilara. "I don't break promises to dead people." There was a silence in the kitchen that had a certain texture to it. "No," Ilara said finally, quietly. "I don't suppose you do." She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, and the negotiation, the real one, began. He told her what he'd seen, and she listened without interrupting, which told him she was either very smart or very desperate, and probably both. The barn angle was a generational mistake. Whoever had built it had positioned it to maximize the morning sun exposure without accounting for the predominant wind direction. That was a decision that made sense in a mild winter and became dangerous in a real one. The walls were taking a battering every year that was slowly working at the joinery, and the current winter was shaping up to be worse than average. The water system was simpler. The main trough ran along the northern face of a structure that provided no insulation and no windbreak, which meant it froze faster than it should, which meant the cattle were spending energy maintaining body heat that they needed to actually make it through January and February. The hay storage sat in a natural depression that collected snowmelt. Whoever had chosen the location had been thinking about convenience. It was close to the barn. Without thinking about drainage, the bottom layer of every hay bale in that storage had been degrading for years. "You can fix all of this," Alara said. Not a question. "I can fix all of it," Caleb said. "Most of it before the first hard storm. Some of it will need to wait for a break in the weather." "And if there isn't a break?" "Then we work in bad weather." She looked at him steadily. "My hands won't like taking orders from a stranger." "I know. Particularly one who's telling them that men with 30 years of experience built things wrong." "I understand that." "Do you?" Caleb set his coffee cup down. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not here to embarrass anyone. I don't care who gets credit. If you want to tell your men that these were your ideas, I'll back you up every time. I just want to fix the problems before they get people killed." He paused. "Or cattle. Whichever you care more about." It was the closest thing to a joke he'd made in 2 weeks. He wasn't sure if it landed until he saw something move at the corner of her mouth. Brief, controlled, gone almost before it appeared. "You'll sleep in the bunkhouse," she said. "The children can have the small room off the kitchen. It stays warmest. You get your meals with the hands, same as everyone else." She stood up. "You're not the foreman. Not yet. You're a new hire who has some ideas. We'll see how it goes." "That's fair," Caleb said. "And Mr. Thornridge." She was already moving toward the hallway. "If any of this turns out to be a scheme to separate a widow from her land, I want you to know I'm an excellent shot, and I've got no patience for that kind of thing." "Noted," Caleb said. He meant it as acknowledgement. But later, thinking about it, he realized it had also been the closest thing to a welcome he'd received in months. Mom. The ranch hands were exactly what he'd expected and exactly as difficult. There were 4 of them wintering on the property. A weathered old man named Pete, who'd been with the Whitmore Ranch for 15 years and treated every new development with the specific suspicion of someone who'd survived by trusting nothing new. A younger man called Dutch, who was competent and knew it and used that knowledge primarily to resist authority. A quiet, angular figure named Sam, who said very little and watched everything. And a large, broad man called Wren, who had a good heart and a strong back, and the unfortunate habit of agreeing with whoever had spoken most recently. They received Caleb with the collective warmth of men who've been told a stranger is sleeping in their bunkhouse and have no say in the matter. "Heard you're here to tell us how we've been doing it wrong," Dutch said, the first morning, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "I'm here to get the ranch through winter," Caleb said. "Same thing you said, different words." "Not exactly." Caleb picked up a spare awl from the workbench and turned it over in his hands. "I'm not saying you've done anything wrong. I'm saying there are some structural problems that could cause serious trouble in a bad storm. That's not about anyone's skill. That's about the way the land sits and the way the wind moves." "The barn's been standing 20 years, Pete said from the corner without looking up. "Yes, sir, and it'll probably stand another 20 if we get lucky with the winters. I'm just thinking about what happens if we don't." Pete looked up at him then. The old man had a way of looking at people that suggested he'd seen enough of life to have very limited patience for nonsense and was still deciding which category Caleb fell into. "You done this before?" Pete asked. "Wintered a ranch through a bad one?" "Several times, different places, different terrain, but the principles are the same." Pete went back to his work, which wasn't agreement but wasn't rejection either. Dutch was less equivocal. "Mrs. Whitmore's letting you do what you want, seems like. But we don't answer to you. You understand that?" "Completely," Caleb said. "Just so we're clear." "We're clear." He went out to look at the barn. Sam followed him quietly, 10 feet back, like a man who hadn't decided yet whether he was interested or suspicious. After a while, Sam said, "You really see all that just from looking at it?" Caleb was examining the north wall of the barn, pressing his palm against the boards, feeling the give. More than there should be. Yeah. How? Caleb thought about it. My father built things. Bad things, mostly. Fell down a lot. I spent my whole childhood watching structures fail and trying to figure out why. He pulled his hand back from the wall. Turns out failure's easier to learn from than success. Success just tells you what worked. Failure tells you exactly what didn't and why. Sam was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a strange way to put it. It's a strange skill to have, Caleb said. The first problem with Gideon Crow came sooner than Caleb expected. Crow arrived 3 days after Caleb, which turned out not to be a coincidence. He came in a sleigh that was newer and better appointed than anything else in the valley, with 2 men riding alongside, and he sat in it with the particular ease of someone who's never had to wonder whether the seat was comfortable. He was maybe 50, with a broad, well-fed face and eyes that moved quickly for a man who otherwise projected total ease. He ran the largest cattle operation in the region. Caleb gathered from context and the careful way Alara's jaw set when she saw him coming, trying to purchase Black Ridge Hollow for the better part of 2 years. Alara! He climbed down from the sleigh and looked around the ranch with the expression of a man evaluating property he intends to own. Then his gaze landed on Caleb, and the expression shifted slightly. New hire? Mr. Crow, Alara said. What brings you out? Neighborly visit. Heard you had some new arrangement going. His eyes stayed on Caleb. People talk. They do, Alara agreed pleasantly. Crow walked toward the barn, hands in his coat pockets, unhurried. I was hearing you've got someone out here telling you your barn's going to fall down. He glanced at Caleb. That you? I said there are structural vulnerabilities worth addressing, Caleb said. Structural vulnerabilities. Crow repeated the phrase with the tone of a man tasting something he finds faintly ridiculous. My family's been wintering cattle in this valley for 40 years. Nobody's barn is falling down. I hope you're right. You hope I'm right. Something in Crow's voice changed, subtle but real. Son, I've got men who've forgotten more about keeping cattle alive in winter than you've learned in your whole life. What is it you actually do, besides show up at struggling ranches with a wagon and a sob story? The ranch hands had drifted closer. This was the kind of moment that defined things, and everyone present understood it. Caleb kept his voice even. I fix things that are about to break. That's a fancy way of saying handyman. If you want. Crow smiled, but it didn't reach those quick eyes. Alara, I'll say what I came to say. I've got a generous offer on the table that'll get you through winter better than any tinker you've picked up off the road. You sell to me before December, and you won't have to gamble on a stranger's barn theories. Alara looked at Crow with an expression that had been refined over years of dealing with this particular pressure. I appreciate the offer, Gideon. Same as the last 14 times. Crow studied her for a moment, then looked back at Caleb. Something passed across his face, not quite threat, not quite amusement. Assessment. You're going to have a rough winter, Crow said. It could have meant the ranch. It could have meant Caleb personally. He left it ambiguous on purpose. Then he climbed back into his sleigh and left the way he came. Pete appeared at Caleb's shoulder. He'll be back, the old man said. I figured, Caleb said. He usually comes twice before the first storm, testing to see if things have gotten desperate enough yet. Caleb watched the sleigh disappear over the ridge. Has it? Gotten desperate enough? Pete was quiet for a moment. Ask me again after you fix the barn, he said. If it holds, no. If it doesn't, he shrugged, and the shrug said everything the words didn't. Caleb went back to work. That night, after the children were asleep, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil and drew out everything he planned to do, in order of urgency. Alara sat across from him with her own ledger, the financial kind, the kind with numbers in it that told a story he could read in the tightness around her eyes. They didn't talk much, but they were in the same room, working on the same problem from different angles, and after a while Alara said, The hay storage. How much have I already lost? Hard to say exactly without pulling bales. Probably 30% of the bottom layer, maybe more. She wrote something in the ledger. That's bad? Yes, ma'am. How fast can you fix it? The drainage? 3 days if the ground isn't frozen too deep yet. After that, I'd need to wait for spring. She looked at the window at the dark outside. The temperature had dropped again this evening. He'd felt it when he'd stepped out to check on the horses. The kind of drop that was a warning. 3 days, she said. All right. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't warmth. It was just a woman who was good at surviving, looking at a problem, and deciding on the fastest available solution. But Caleb noticed before she turned back to her ledger that some of the tightness around her eyes had eased. Slightly, just enough to see. Outside, the wind picked up, moving across the ridge in long, slow waves, like something breathing, patient, cold, and completely indifferent to anything any of them had planned. Winter was coming, and Blackridge Hollow was nowhere near ready. The drainage fix took 4 days, not 3. Caleb had been off by 1 day because the ground along the eastern edge of the hay storage had already started to freeze. Not deep, not yet, but enough to make the first morning's work slow and ugly. He'd gone out before first light with a pickaxe and a spade and worked until Pete came out at sunrise, looked at what he was doing, and stood there for a full minute without saying anything. Then the old man went back to the bunkhouse and came out with another spade. He didn't explain himself, didn't say anything about changing his mind or deciding Caleb was worth helping. He just started digging from the other end, and that was that. They worked mostly in silence, which suited Caleb fine. The cold was the kind that made talking feel wasteful, every breath visible, fingers stiffening inside the gloves, the ground giving up its resistance grudgingly and in small increments. By mid-morning, Dutch had also appeared, not offering to help exactly, but standing close enough that when Caleb needed someone to hold the far end of a drainage channel guide, Dutch was there without being asked. That was how it started, not with any speech or any moment of conversion, just cold ground and work that needed doing, and not enough hours in the day to get precious about who was doing it. By the 4th afternoon, they had the drainage redirected, the storage platform raised 6 inches on new timber supports, and the bottom layer of compromised hay pulled out and assessed. The loss was closer to 35% than 30%. Alara had come out to look at the pulled bales stacked beside the structure, and she'd stood there with her arms crossed and a look on her face that Caleb had learned to read as the expression she wore when she was doing math she didn't like the answer to. "Can we make it to spring?" she asked. "With what's left, yes. Tight, but yes. If the winter runs long past March, it gets harder. It ran long last year. Then we might need to look at purchasing additional hay before December, while the roads are still passable." She looked at him. "That costs money I was planning to use elsewhere." "I know. Is it necessary, or is it a precaution?" Caleb thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. "Precaution that becomes necessary if we get unlucky." "Your call." Alara looked back at the pulled bales. She was quiet long enough that Pete, who was standing nearby, started to look uncomfortable. The old man read silence the way some people read weather, and this particular silence apparently had a texture he didn't like. "Order the hay," she said finally. She walked back to the house, and Caleb went back to work, and nobody said anything about what had just happened. But something had shifted, imperceptibly, in the way the ranch functioned. Something about the way Dutch stopped angling his body away from Caleb when they were in the same space. Something about the way Sam started appearing near whatever Caleb was working on, not helping necessarily, just present, watching the way a man watches something he's decided is worth understanding. The windbreak was harder to explain. Caleb had been thinking about it since the first day, turning the problem over in his mind, the way you turn a stone over to see what's living underneath. The standard approach, building a windbreak tight against the barn and outbuildings, felt wrong to him, and he'd spent 3 nights trying to work out why before it finally came clear. The issue was snow accumulation. A windbreak placed close to the structures would slow the wind, yes, but it would create a pocket of turbulence directly in front of the barn entrance, a place where snow would pile and pack faster than anywhere else on the property. In a bad storm, that could seal the entrance. He'd seen it happen once, years ago, at a ranch in Wyoming. By the time they dug out, 2 cattle were dead and 3 more were in bad shape from stress and cold. So he designed the windbreak to sit at a distance, far enough that the snow accumulation zone fell between the break and the barn, not at the entrance itself. The wind would slow before it reached the structures, and the heaviest snow dump would happen in open space where it didn't matter. When he explained this to the ranch hands, Dutch's response was immediate and not particularly constructive. That's not how windbreaks work. It's not how they're usually built, Caleb agreed, but the principle is sound. The principle. Dutch repeated it with the same inflection Crow had used on structural vulnerabilities. You want to put the windbreak 20 yards from the barn and leave a gap in between, in a blizzard. The gap is intentional. Snow accumulates in the turbulence zone. If the break is too close, that turbulence zone is your barn entrance. Or, Dutch said, the snow accumulates in the gap, and we've just made ourselves a nice, even bigger snowdrift between us and the cattle. It was a fair objection. Caleb gave it the respect it deserved. That's a real risk. The distance needs to be calculated right. Too close, and we get the turbulence problem. Too far, and we don't slow the wind enough, and the accumulation you're describing becomes an issue. And you know the right distance. I know what I think the right distance is. I could be wrong. Dutch stared at him. Well, that's a hell of a confidence builder. I'd rather tell you I could be wrong than pretend I'm certain and have us find out the hard way, Caleb said. That silenced Dutch for a moment. Not agreement. Dutch wasn't built for easy agreement, but something close to a pause in the resistance, like a man who'd been pushing against a door that suddenly wasn't pushing back. Wren, who had been listening from 10 feet away with the concentrated expression he wore whenever he was trying to form an opinion before someone else formed it for him, said, "What does Mrs. Whitmore think?" She said to build it and see, Caleb said. That wasn't quite what Alar had said. What she'd actually said was, if this doesn't work, I'm going to need you to explain it to me very carefully before the next storm, which was her version of approval. They started building the windbreak the following morning. It took 6 days. The posts were the worst of it. The ground was getting harder every night now, and setting posts in freezing ground is the kind of work that strips the skin off your palms if you're not careful and strips it off anyway if you are. Caleb worked alongside the hands every day, which he hadn't been sure they'd respect. Some men resented a supervisor who rolled up his sleeves, reading it as a challenge to their adequacy. But this crew, he was learning, was the other kind, the kind that respected visible effort more than delegated authority. Thomas came out on the third day and asked if he could help. Caleb looked at his son. The boy was thin in the way kids get when they've been underfed for long enough that the thinness becomes structural, but there was color in his cheeks from the cold and his eyes were alert in a way they hadn't been in weeks. You can hand materials, Caleb said. Stay away from the post setting. Ground's unstable and I don't want you near the tools if something slips. Thomas nodded with the gravity of someone receiving field orders and went to work without another word. Sam watched this from nearby. Later, when Caleb was taking a water break, cold water, which was its own punishment but necessary, Sam came over and said quietly, "Good kid." "Yeah," Caleb said, "he is." "Lost his mother?" "April." Sam nodded, didn't offer anything else. But after that, whenever Thomas was out near the work, Sam had a particular awareness of where the boy was. Nothing overt, just the quiet positioning of a man who's decided to keep an eye on something without making an announcement about it. Caleb noticed. He filed it away with the other things he was noticing about this ranch, about these people. The way Pete's years of skepticism had a bedrock of genuine care for the property underneath it. The way Wren's agreeableness masked a physical competence that became obvious when there was hard work to do. The way Alara managed the whole operation with the kind of controlled tension of someone who'd been running on will for long enough that will had become muscle memory. They were all holding something together that had been in danger of falling apart. The difference, Caleb was starting to think, was that they'd been holding it together alone, each in their own corner, not quite trusting each other enough to combine the effort. He wasn't sure how to fix that. He wasn't even sure it was his place to try. Then Gideon Crow came back. He came alone this time, which was different, more personal. He arrived on horseback on a Tuesday afternoon when Caleb was up on the barn roof reinforcing the north-facing joinery, genuinely precarious work in the cold, requiring full concentration, and he stood below and watched for a while before he said anything. "That's not how you sister a joist," Crow called up. Caleb didn't stop working. "It's not sistering, it's collar tying, different load distribution." A pause. "I know what collar tying is." "Then you know it's appropriate here." Another pause. Caleb finished the section he was on and moved carefully to the next one, acutely aware that he was on an icy roof 15 feet off the ground, having an argument, which was not a situation that rewarded distraction. "Come down," Crow said. "I want to talk." "I'll be down in 20 minutes. I'll wait." He did. Caleb finished the work, climbed down with the care of a man who respects the consequences of falling, and found Crow standing by his horse with his hands in his coat pockets, surveying the property with that evaluating look. "You've been busy," Crow said. "That's the job." "The windbreak." Crow nodded toward it. "Unusual placement." "Yes. I've heard of the theory, never seen anyone actually implement it out here." He looked at Caleb directly. "Either you're very smart or you're very lucky. Haven't figured out which yet." "Neither have I," Caleb said. Something moved in Crow's expression. Surprised, maybe, by the honesty. He studied Caleb for a moment with those quick eyes. "Here's what I'm going to say to you man to man," Crow said. "I've been trying to buy this ranch for 2 years. Alara Whitmore is a proud woman, and she's been holding out because she doesn't want to feel like she's giving up on her husband's land. I respect that. But she's losing ground every winter, and she knows it, and one bad season is going to make the decision for her." He paused. "What I don't need is someone coming in here and giving her false hope that delays the inevitable by a year and makes it harder for everyone." Caleb looked at him steadily. "What if it's not false hope? What if it is? Then we'll all know by March." Caleb kept his voice flat, no heat in it. "But if I'm right and this ranch makes it through in good shape, you lose a property you want, and some people keep the home they've built. That seems like a reasonable gamble from where I'm standing." Crow's jaw tightened slightly. Just slightly. "You're a stubborn man. Mrs. Whitmore would probably say that's a minimum requirement for working here." Crow looked at the ranch for a long moment. The new windbreak, the raised hay storage, the barn roof with its reinforced joinery. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it contained. "Don't let her down," he said finally. It wasn't a warning. Or it was, but it wasn't only a warning. There was something else layered underneath it that Caleb couldn't quite name. Crow mounted up and rode out without another word. The first storm arrived 11 days later. It wasn't the big one. Caleb had been watching the signs, and this was a precursor, a valley storm that would run maybe 18 to 24 hours and drop a significant amount of snow. Significant enough to be a real test. Not significant enough to be catastrophic if the systems failed, which was precisely what happened. The systems partially failed. The windbreak performed better than Dutch expected and worse than Caleb hoped. The snow accumulation zone fell mostly where Caleb had predicted, but the eastern end of the break had a gap in the post spacing. A mistake in his calculations, 2 inches too wide, that created a secondary drift line running directly toward the barn entrance. Not enough to seal it, but enough to require 3 hours of shoveling after the storm ended that shouldn't have been necessary. More significantly, the redesigned entrance approach, which Caleb had modified to give the cattle a clearer sight line in, had the opposite effect. The opening angle caught the wind at a pitch that sent it straight into the structure, and the cattle, who were not animals known for their philosophical acceptance of unexpected sensory experiences, had spooked. 3 animals had pushed back against the far wall hard enough that Wren had a bruised rib from trying to manage them. Dutch didn't say "I told you so." He didn't have to. His silence said it with considerable precision. Caleb stood in the barn after the storm, looking at the evidence of what had gone wrong, and felt the particular cold of someone confronting the gap between what they thought and what was true. He could defend himself. He had the arguments. The windbreak had slowed the storm measurably. The instruments he'd set up confirmed it. The core systems had performed. The failures were specific and correctable. He didn't defend himself. "The entrance angle is wrong," he said to Alara, to the hands, to anyone standing close enough to hear. "I miscalculated the wind effect on the cattle approach. That needs to be rebuilt." He looked at Dutch. "You mentioned the cattle sightline issue 2 weeks ago. I should have listened more carefully." Dutch blinked. Whatever response he'd been preparing for, it wasn't that. "And the post spacing on the east end of the windbreak is too wide," Caleb continued. "I can fix that in a day. The drift line it created is the source of the entrance shoveling problem, not the placement theory itself." He looked at Alara. "The theory is sound. The execution had errors. I'd like the chance to correct them." Alara was looking at him with an expression that was new. Not quite approval, not quite surprise, something closer to careful reassessment, like she was adjusting a calculation she'd already made. "What do you need?" she said. "A day for the post spacing, 2 for the entrance redesign." He paused. "And I'd want Mrs. Whitmore's input on the entrance. You've been moving cattle in and out of that barn for years. You know how they behave in bad conditions better than I do." That landed somewhere in the room. Caleb could feel it. Pete made a small sound that might have been a cough, and might have been something else. Wren looked at the floor with the expression of someone who's just witnessed something he'll be thinking about for a while. Dutch crossed his arms, uncrossed them, looked out the barn door at the retreating storm. "The east post gap," he said. "I can help with that." "I'd appreciate it," Caleb said. They rebuilt the entrance approach with Alara's input, which turned out to be substantial. She knew, from years of daily observation, that these particular cattle had a strong left-side bias when stressed, and that any design that forced them to approach from the right, in poor visibility, was going to produce exactly the result they'd seen. Caleb moved the approach angle 14 degrees to the left and added a low guide rail on the right side that gave the animals something to orient by in low visibility without forcing the approach direction. He wasn't sure it would work until he tested it. It worked. The second storm, smaller, faster, a week after the first, came through and the cattle moved without incident. Dutch watched from the barn doorway with an expression that was approximately neutral but contained a quality of attention that was its own kind of acknowledgement. The post-gap fix had solved the driftline issue. The entrance approach was clean. And the documentation Caleb had been keeping, temperature readings, wind direction records, cattle behavior notes, a precise log of what each system had done and when, was starting to form a picture that even Pete seemed to find interesting. The old man had started reading the logs each morning, not commenting, just reading, with the focused expression he wore when information was making him reconsider something. And through all of it, through the errors and the corrections and the gradual grinding accumulation of small improvements, through Nora attaching herself to Alara's kitchen with the determined warmth of a small animal who has found the best heat source in the building, and Thomas developing a working relationship with Sam that consisted mainly of the boy following the man around asking questions until Sam started answering them. Through all of it, the winter kept building outside the walls of Black Ridge Hollow. Not the storm they feared, not yet. But everything pointed the same direction. The temperature log showed a pattern Caleb had seen before. The wind records showed something similar. The old-timers in the valley talked about the Whitehorn storms, the ones that came every decade or so, the ones that separated ranches that had prepared from ranches that hadn't. And the signs were accumulating with a patience that was almost deliberate. Caleb worked every day until the light was gone, and sometimes after. He was sitting at the kitchen table late one night, the house quiet, everyone else asleep, working through the supply calculations for the third time when Alara came in. She hadn't been asleep either. He could tell by the way she moved, alert and deliberate, not the careful navigation of someone half awake. She poured herself coffee and sat down across from him without being invited, which was how she handled most things in her own kitchen. "You're worried," she said. "Not a question." Caleb looked up. "About specific things, yes." "What things?" "The water system still needs reinforcement, not the trough. The pipe run from the main line to the barn. If we get a sustained cold snap below -20, the current insulation isn't enough." He pointed to the relevant entry in his notes. "And the windbreak needs one more support post on the west end. I keep looking at that section and it bothers me." Alara looked at the notes. "How long to fix both?" "Waterline is 3 days. Support post is a few hours." "Do the post tomorrow. Prioritize the waterline." "That's what I was thinking." She looked up from the notes. "You could have made this easier on yourself, you know. When the entrance failed and the drift line was wrong after the first storm, you could have blamed the weather, blamed the ground conditions. Nobody would have questioned it." Caleb thought about that. "I would have questioned it." Alara looked at him for a moment in the particular way she had. Direct, not unkind, slightly measuring. "My husband would have blamed the weather," she said. She said it matter-of-factly, without cruelty, without sentimentality, just a statement of fact placed on the table between them. He was a good man. He just couldn't stand being wrong. Caleb didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say to that. The valley thinks I should have sold, Alara said. After he died. They think I'm holding on because I don't know how to let go. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. It's not that. It's that I looked at what he built and I thought, someone should at least try to make it work properly, before giving up. Caleb looked at the window, at the dark outside, at the weather moving somewhere out there in the black, patient and enormous. It can work properly, he said. I think we're getting there. Alara looked at him, and for just a moment, the controlled composure she wore like a second coat was not quite all the way on, and underneath it was something that was just a person who was tired and had been carrying a great deal for a long time. Then it was back in place, and she stood up and took her coffee. Get some sleep, Mr. Thornridge, she said. Waterline starts early. She was gone before he could respond. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge in long, deliberate waves, as though the season itself was gathering something, pulling energy from the sky and the frozen ground, storing it for a single enormous effort. No one on Black Ridge Hollow knew exactly when it would come, but everything they'd done, every post, every pipe, every recalculated angle and corrected measurement, was the answer they were preparing for a question that hadn't been asked yet. The question was coming. The waterline took 4 days, not 3. Caleb had known it might. The pipe run from the main line to the barn passed under a section of ground that had frozen harder than the rest. A peculiarity of the terrain, a low spot where cold air pooled and the frost drove deeper than anywhere else on the property. He'd noted it in his logs 3 weeks ago and flagged it as a potential problem. What he hadn't anticipated was how much of the existing insulation wrap had degraded. When he dug down to the pipe on the second morning and pulled back the old burlap packing, what came away in his hands was essentially mulch, wet, compressed, useless. How bad? Alara said. She was standing at the edge of the excavation, arms crossed, watching him with the patient attention she gave to problems she'd decided to take seriously. Bad enough that I'm surprised it didn't freeze last month. He held up a section of the degraded packing. This has been rotting for a while. Whoever last wrapped it used burlap without any exterior protection. First wet season saturated it, and it started decomposing. My husband rewrapped that line the winter before he died. Caleb set the packing down carefully. He used the right instinct, wrong material. Alara was quiet for a moment. What do you need? Proper pipe insulation if we can get it from town. If not, I can build up a layered wrap with what we have. Oilcloth over dry straw packing, tightly bound. It's not ideal, but it'll hold. Roads are getting uncertain. I'll send Dutch for supplies today while they're still passable. She looked at the exposed pipe, at the length of excavation, at the gray sky above the ridge. Do you think we have time? Caleb looked at the same sky. He'd been watching it for 3 days. The way the cloud base had been dropping incrementally, the way the morning temperatures had been hitting new lows, even in the relatively mild hours after dawn, the way the wind had started carrying a particular dry quality that he associated with systems building a long way off. If Dutch goes today, yes, he said. Dutch went that afternoon and came back the following morning with proper insulation material and a look on his face that said the roads had been an experience he didn't want to repeat soon. He handed the supplies to Caleb without ceremony and went directly to the bunkhouse to get warm, which told Caleb everything he needed to know about conditions in the valley. They finished the water line on the 4th day. Caleb tested it 3 times, running water through while Pete held a lamp down near the most vulnerable sections watching for the behavior that indicated imminent freezing. The pipe held. The temperature in that section stayed measurably warmer than the ambient ground temperature around it. Pete stood up slowly, pressing a hand to his lower back, and said, "All right, that'll do." From Pete, that was a standing ovation. By the time they were done, the temperature had dropped another 6 degrees from where it had been at the start of the week. The sky had taken on the particular flat white opacity that Caleb associated with serious weather gathering its forces. Sam had started spending his evenings sharpening tools and checking equipment, not because anyone asked him to, but because Sam was the kind of man who prepared for bad things quietly and in advance, without discussion. It was Sam who said it first. He came in from the evening cattle check one night, stomped the snow off his boots in the doorway, and said to the room in general, "Something's building." Nobody argued with him. The preparation that followed was the most focused 2 weeks Caleb had experienced since arriving at Black Ridge Hollow. There was a quality to the work now that hadn't been there before, a shared understanding of what they were preparing for, an agreement without words that the casual resistance and the territorial maneuvering had run out of time and relevance. Dutch worked alongside Caleb without commentary. Wren threw himself at the physical tasks with an energy that seemed to come from somewhere deep. Pete moved more slowly than the others, but with a precision that wasted nothing. They built a secondary supply cache inside the barn. Food for the cattle carefully calculated to last 6 weeks at full consumption, plus 20% for safety. They reinforced the barn's internal structure with additional bracing on the north-facing wall, the wall that would take the direct force of any storm coming off the ridge. They dug out and marked a pathway between the main house and the barn with posts set at 10-foot intervals, each post topped with a strip of red cloth. Alara's idea? Practical and immediate. In whiteout conditions, you navigate by what you can touch. Caleb recorded everything. Every temperature reading 3 times a day, wind direction and estimated speed. Cattle behavior, which turned out to be one of the most reliable indicators he had. The animals became quieter and more tightly clustered as the pressure changed, and he logged that too, a behavioral barometer that cost nothing to maintain. Nora helped him, in her way. She had developed a system, entirely her own, entirely 4-year-old in its logic, of making small marks on a piece of paper each morning when Caleb read the thermometer, marking hard with the pencil when it was very cold and softer when it was less cold. The resulting record was not scientifically precise, but it was a graph of sorts. And when Caleb showed her that the marks had been getting consistently harder for 2 weeks, she looked at the paper with a gravity that was almost funny and almost not. "Is the cold coming?" she asked. "Yes," Caleb said. "A lot of it." "Will it hurt the cows?" "Not if we do our job right." She looked at him with the direct, unfiltered assessment that was her primary mode of engagement with the world. "Are we doing our job right?" "I think so," Caleb said. "I think we are." She went back to her marks, pressing very hard. Thomas had changed in ways that Caleb watched with a complicated feeling he couldn't entirely sort out. The boy had been carrying a weight since Margaret died. Not just grief, something more specific. The weight of a child who has decided, without anyone telling him to, that he needs to be useful enough to justify the space he takes up. Caleb had seen it and hadn't known how to address it, which was one of many ways in which he was still working out how to be a father without the person who'd made it feel possible. What was happening on the ranch was doing something for Thomas that Caleb hadn't managed on his own. Sam had taken the boy under something that wasn't quite mentorship. Sam was too quiet and self-contained for anything that organized, but was a consistent, low-key form of inclusion. Thomas helped Sam with the cattle checks. He learned to read the behavioral signs Sam watched for. He learned the marker post route to the barn and walked it several times until he could navigate it in the dark. One evening, Caleb found them in the barn together, Sam showing Thomas how to check a hoof for the early signs of problems that cold weather accelerated. The boy watching with the concentrated expression he got when he was memorizing something he'd decided mattered. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched for a moment and didn't say anything and went back to the house. The storm warnings came not as any official declaration. There were no officials to declare anything in this corner of the frontier, but as an accumulation of signs that everyone on the ranch had learned to read. The cattle stopped eating properly 2 days before. The temperature log showed a flat line at the bottom of its range, as though the thermometer had run out of places to go. The wind shifted to the northwest and stayed there, steady and building, carrying a cold that had a different quality than the cold of the past weeks. Deeper, more serious, the kind of cold that didn't posture. On the morning the storm hit, Caleb was already in the barn. He'd been there since 4 a.m, checking the final preparations by lantern light, going through his mental inventory for the 4th time. Water line, insulated and functional. Hay supply, adequate. Secondary cache, stocked. Bracing, in place. Marker posts, set. He went through each item the way a man goes through the contents of a room he's about to leave, making sure he hasn't forgotten anything important. Pete found him there at 5:30 and said nothing for a long moment, just stood with his lantern and looked at what Caleb had done to the barn and the storage and the entire defensive posture of the ranch. "When you first showed up," Pete said finally, I thought you were full of it. I know. Still think some of your ideas are strange. Some of them are, Caleb said. Pete looked at the reinforced north wall, at the interior supply cache, at the cattle settling into the positions they naturally gravitated toward when they sensed something coming. But you know what you're doing, he said. It was the flattest, most stripped-down form of respect Caleb had ever been paid, and it landed with more weight than a speech would have. The first real force of the storm arrived at mid-morning. It didn't build gradually. It arrived, which was the difference between this storm and the ones they'd practiced on. The wind went from significant to violent in the span of about 15 minutes, and the snow came horizontal, not falling, moving sideways with a density that turned the air white and eliminated visibility to roughly the length of an arm. Caleb made it from the main house to the barn using the marker posts, one hand on each post as he reached it, moving as quickly as he dared. The distance was perhaps 40 yards. It took him 8 minutes. At 3 points, he lost sight of the next post entirely and had to slow almost to a stop, hand extended, feeling for it, the cold working at the exposed skin of his face with a focused intensity that was purely mechanical. No malice, just physics, doing what cold does. Dutch was already in the barn when Caleb arrived. He'd come out an hour earlier to manage the cattle feeding before the worst hit, and the worst had hit faster than expected. Gate latch on the east stall is stiff, Dutch said without preamble. Gets much colder, it's going to freeze solid. I've got grease in the supply cache, top right, tin container. Dutch found it and dealt with the latch without being asked to. Caleb checked the water trough, flowing, not frozen, the insulated pipe doing exactly what it was supposed to do, and then moved through the barn doing the systematic check he'd trained himself to do, looking for anything the storm had introduced that hadn't been there before. The cattle were loud in the way animals get loud when they're stressed, but not panicking. A restless, communicative noise, constant movement, bodies shifting against each other for warmth and reassurance. Caleb moved through them slowly, deliberately, letting them register his presence as something familiar and non-threatening. They're okay, Dutch said, watching him. A little wound up, but okay. The noise level will peak in the next 2 hours and then they'll settle, Caleb said. As long as the temperature inside stays above 15 degrees, they'll manage. And if it drops below 15? Caleb had a contingency for that, which involved the secondary heating arrangement he'd built into the rear of the barn, a shielded brazier that could be managed safely in the enclosed space, feeding from a supply of coal he'd brought in specifically for this scenario. He explained it to Dutch, and Dutch listened with the focused attention of someone who has stopped performing skepticism and started performing readiness. Outside, the storm compounded itself. The wind built in waves rather than steadily, each wave slightly worse than the last, and between the waves there were moments of comparative quiet that were somehow more ominous than the noise, as though the storm was breathing, drawing in before the next push. Alara had stayed in the main house with the children for the first half of the day. This had been the agreement. In the initial phase, she managed the house provisions and communications, while Caleb managed the barn and the outer systems. It was a clean division of responsibility, and Caleb had not questioned it. At early afternoon, she appeared at the barn door. She was wearing 2 coats, and her face showed the wind had been working on her during the crossing. She took a moment to get her breath, pulled ice from her eyebrows with a practical lack of ceremony, and looked around the barn with the assessing gaze she gave to everything. "How are they?" she said. "Stable. Water's holding. Temperature inside is 18 degrees. She nodded. "The house is fine. 17 inside, fire's drawing well." She moved down the center of the barn, touching animals as she passed them. Not to calm them, Caleb realized, but to check them, running her hands along flanks and checking ears and eyes with the quick competence of someone who's done this 10,000 times. "Rosie is off," she said, stopping at the 3rd stall from the left. Caleb followed her look. The oldest milk cow, the one the hands called Rosie with the casual affection that ranch animals accumulate over years, was standing with her weight shifted in a way that was subtly wrong. Not distressed exactly, but different. Alara put both hands on the animal and was still for a moment with the concentration of someone listening for something. Then she said, "She's going to calve." Caleb looked at her. "Now?" "Not right now, but today. Maybe tonight. Alara's voice was level, but there was something behind it that wasn't level. She's early, by about 3 weeks. Dutch had come over. How early is too early? Alara didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer of sorts. Rosie was the oldest animal on the ranch and had been through multiple calvings, which was a point in their favor. But early labor under stress, in extreme cold, without any possibility of outside assistance, Caleb ran the variables and none of them were comfortable. "We'll need to stay with her," Alara said. "I wasn't going anywhere," Caleb said. She looked at him briefly. "No, I don't suppose you were." The storm outside continued its work. By late afternoon, the wind had reached a pitch that made the barn walls flex perceptibly. Not dangerously, the reinforcing held, but enough to feel, enough to register in the body as a low-grade physical warning. The temperature log inside the barn showed 15 degrees now. Caleb lit the brazier, monitoring the ventilation with care, watching the cattle for signs of respiratory distress from the smoke. They showed none. Thomas appeared at the barn door at dusk, which was not part of any plan. Caleb was at Rosie's stall when he heard the latch and turned to find his son pushing the door shut behind him, face red from the cold, eyes bright with the effort of the crossing. "Thomas!" Caleb's voice came out harder than he intended. "You were supposed to stay in the house." "Nora's asleep. I followed the posts." The boy's chin came up slightly. "I know the route." "That's not—" Caleb stopped. He looked at his son, at the careful steadiness in the boy's face, and understood that there was no version of this conversation where he sent Thomas back into the storm alone. "Get over here and get warm." Thomas came and stood by the brazier with the focused, serious expression that had replaced his childhood expression sometime in the past year. After a moment, he looked at Rosie with the attention Sam had trained into him. "Is she sick?" "She's going to have her calf," Caleb said. "Early." "Is that bad?" "It's complicated." Thomas thought about that. "What can I do?" Alara, who was at the other side of the stall, looked over at the boy. Something moved in her expression that was quick and unguarded and gone almost immediately. "You can get the lantern from the hook by the door and bring it here," she said. "We're going to need the light." Thomas went and got the lantern. The hours that followed were the hardest of the night. Rosie's labor was slow and complicated by the cold, by her age, by the stress of the storm. Alara directed the process with the calm authority of someone who has done difficult things enough times to know that calm is not the same as easy. It's just a choice you make about how you're going to carry the difficulty. Caleb assisted where Alara directed him, which meant learning quickly, which he was good at. Dutch paced the length of the barn and didn't pretend he wasn't worried. Sam, who had come in from his own bunk check, took up a position near the cattle that needed managing and simply stayed there, steady and quiet. Thomas held the lantern exactly where Alara told him to and did not look away from any of it, which told Caleb something about his son that he hadn't known before. At somewhere past midnight, with the storm still driving against the walls and the temperature in the barn holding at 13 degrees, and everyone in the building running on cold and exhaustion and the particular focus that crisis produces, Rosie's calf arrived. It was not a smooth arrival. It was messy and slow, and there was a period of perhaps 10 minutes where Alara was working with an expression that had gone past professional calm into something more stripped down and urgent, her hands moving with a precision that brooked no discussion. Then the calf was there, and it was alive, and it was small and wet and not particularly interested in the world it had just entered, which was fair given the world it had just entered. Alara sat back on her heels in the straw and pressed her forearm across her eyes, which was the closest thing to visible exhaustion she'd allowed since the storm started. "There she is," Alara said. Her voice had a quality in it that Caleb hadn't heard before. Not soft exactly, but unguarded. Dutch made a sound from across the barn that he immediately converted into a cough. Thomas was still holding the lantern. His arm had to be aching by now. He was looking at the calf with an expression that was complicated and young and completely unprotected. Caleb put his hand briefly on his son's shoulder. Thomas leaned into it, just slightly, for just a second. Outside, the Whitehorn blizzard continued its work, indifferent to everything that had just happened inside those walls. The wind drove against the reinforced north face and found it still standing. The water line moved its water steadily through its insulated channel. The marker posts held their positions in the white darkness, red cloth snapping in the wind, marking the route between the house and the barn so that anyone who needed to make that crossing could make it and arrive. The systems held. Not perfectly. The temperature in the northeast corner of the barn dropped to 11 degrees before morning, and they had to rotate 2 of the younger cattle away from it, which was a scramble and a problem. A section of roofing on the equipment shed blew partially free in the night's worst gust and made a sound like a crack of something breaking, which brought everyone to their feet before they identified what it was. And Dutch, who went out at 3 in the morning to check the windbreak, came back with ice in his beard and the look of a man who's had a conversation with something larger than himself. "It's holding," he said. "The West End support post is flexing, but it's holding." Caleb looked at him. "The one I added last week." "Yeah." Neither of them said anything else about it. They didn't need to. By morning, the storm had not stopped, but had shifted. Still violent, but no longer escalating. The temperature inside the barn had stabilized at 14 degrees, which was not comfortable, but was survivable. Rosie's calf had nursed twice during the night, small tentative efforts that were the most hopeful thing Caleb had seen in weeks. Alara stood at the barn door in the thin gray light of a morning that was more concept than reality. The light barely distinguishable from the dark, the storm making every edge soft and uncertain, and looked out at the white world beyond the entrance with an expression Caleb couldn't fully read. He came to stand beside her. They were both exhausted in the specific way of people who have been awake all night doing hard things, the kind of tired that lives in the joints. "The West End post on the windbreak," Alara said. "Dutch said it was flexing. I'll check it when there's enough light to see. If it fails, it won't fail," Caleb said. And then, because he'd learned by now that Alara didn't want reassurance, she wanted honesty. "I think it won't fail. The wood I used for that post was the best piece in the lot, but I'll check it." She nodded. She looked back out at the storm. "My husband built this ranch on the idea that you fought the land," she said. Not bitterly, just factually, the way she said most things. "Fight the cold, fight the wind, fight the terrain, hold it back by force." Caleb waited. "He was strong," she said. "Strongest man I ever knew. It didn't save him." She was quiet for a moment. "What you're doing is different. You're not fighting it. You're working with it somehow, making space for it." "Trying to," Caleb said. "It doesn't always cooperate." "No," Alara said. "It doesn't." Something in her voice shifted, very slightly. "But we're still here." She stepped back from the door and went to check on the calf, and Caleb stood in the opening for another moment, looking out at the white and the dark and the storm that still had things to say. They were still here. The barn was standing, the cattle were alive, the water was running, and a calf born 3 weeks early in the worst storm in a decade was nursing in the straw behind him. It wasn't victory, it wasn't even close to over, but it was enough to keep going. The storm did not end on the second day. That had been the assumption, not stated outright because nobody wanted to be the person who said it and turned out to be wrong, but present in the way people move and work when they believe a thing is nearly finished. By midday of the second day, when the wind had not dropped and the snow had not thinned and the temperature outside had fallen another 4 degrees, that assumption quietly died and was replaced by something harder and more honest. This was not going to be over soon. Caleb adjusted the supply calculations in his head while he was doing 3 other things simultaneously, which was a skill born of necessity and refined by the kind of parenthood that doesn't come with backup. The hay supply was adequate. He'd built in the 20% buffer precisely for a scenario like this, a storm that ran longer than expected. The water line was holding. The cattle, after the stressful first night, had settled into the particular stoic endurance that was apparently their natural mode when the world became unacceptable. Rosie's calf, which Nora had named Button with an authority that brooked no discussion, was taking milk consistently, which was the number Caleb cared about most from the barn. What he hadn't fully accounted for was the human cost. By the morning of the second day, everyone was tired in ways that compounded badly. Dutch had developed a cough somewhere in the night hours that he was aggressively ignoring. Pete's hands were giving him trouble, the cold working into old joints in the way that's not dramatic but is relentless. and Caleb could see him favoring his right hand when he thought no one was watching. Sam was fine, or appeared to be, but Sam's version of fine was illegible enough that Caleb wasn't entirely certain. Alara was running on something beyond tiredness. Caleb watched her move through the barn and the house with the mechanical efficiency of a person who has decided that their body's objections are irrelevant, and recognized it because he'd operated the same way after Margaret died, and remembered that it eventually extracts a cost whether you're prepared for it or not. Thomas had slept 4 hours on a pile of horse blankets in the corner of the barn and woken up ready to work again, which was both impressive and concerning in the specific way that children's resilience can be concerning when you know what's driving it. Nora had slept through most of it in the main house with an enviable completeness, woken up, eaten everything Alara put in front of her, and gone to visit Button with the focused devotion of someone managing an important relationship. At mid-morning of the second day, Caleb did the marker post crossing from barn to house in the worst conditions yet. The wind had developed a rotational quality that made direction unreliable, gusts coming from angles that didn't match the prevailing flow, and twice he was hit by a lateral burst that pushed him off the path entirely. Both times he stopped, controlled the instinct to rush, and located the nearest post by feel before moving again. The thing about the marker posts was that they only worked if you trusted them and moved slowly enough to use them. Rushing in a whiteout was how people died. He'd seen it, heard about it, read accounts of men found 50 yards from shelter, frozen, who had panicked and moved fast in the wrong direction and never corrected. He made the house in 11 minutes and came in stamping snow from his boots to find Nora at the kitchen table, regarding him with the forensic attention she reserved for things that concerned her. "You were gone a long time," she said. 11 minutes, Caleb said. "That's a long time." "It's slow going out there." He pulled off his outer coat and hung it near the fire to dry. "How's Button?" Her expression shifted to the complicated mixture of pride and anxiety that the calf had been producing in her since birth. "Sam says she ate again this morning." "That's good." He said it twice. Nora looked at her hands. "That means it's really good." Caleb looked at his daughter, at the serious, small face, at the careful way she was paying attention to everything, at the 4-year-old logic she was applying to an adult situation with a precision that was sometimes startling. He sat down across from her. "We're okay," he said. "The barn is holding. Button is eating. Everyone is cold and tired, but nobody is hurt." She looked at him. "Are you scared?" He thought about lying, considered it seriously as a parental option, and decided she'd know. She always knew. "A little," he said. "But scared and okay can be the same thing." She chewed on that for a moment. Then, "Is that true?" "Yeah," he said. "It really is." She seemed to find this satisfactory in some way he didn't entirely understand, and went back to whatever she'd been doing before he came in. The collapse warning came from Dutch at 2 in the afternoon. He came in from an equipment check with ice across his shoulders and a look that Caleb recognized immediately as the look of a man delivering news he's already decided he doesn't like. "The west section of the windbreak," Dutch said. 3 posts. "They're going!" Caleb was moving before Dutch finished the sentence, reaching for his outer coat. "Caleb," Alara's voice from across the room. He turned. She was already reading the situation, reading him, with the quick assessment that had become familiar. "How bad if it goes?" "The western approach to the barn entrance gets buried," Caleb said. "We lose access. Cattle are trapped inside with no way to manage the feeding properly, and when the storm breaks, we've got a digging problem that costs time we may not have in good health." He was buttoning the coat. "I need to get out there." "In this?" "Yes." She looked at him for 2 full seconds. He could see her running calculations he wasn't fully privy to. "You need someone on the rope," she said. "Dutch is coughing hard enough that he shouldn't be standing in that wind." She said it without looking at Dutch, which was the kindness of someone who understands that pride is a limited resource and shouldn't be spent on the obvious. "I'll take the rope." Dutch opened his mouth, closed it. The cough he'd been suppressing came out anyway, which settled the argument. Caleb looked at Alara. "You understand what that means. If I go down out there, holding that rope is the only way I come back." "I understand what it means," she said evenly. "Do you have a better option?" He didn't. He'd built the safety rope system himself, specifically for this kind of scenario. A 60-foot line, one end secured to the barn anchor point, the other end held by someone stationed at the barn door. The man on the rope could navigate by feel and be pulled back if he went down. Without the anchor person, the system was just a rope attached to nothing useful. "Pete," Caleb said, "what about him?" "He anchors from inside the barn. You hold the door position. If I signal twice on the rope, 2 hard pulls, Pete starts pulling from inside and you manage the line from your end. Don't let it go slack." "I won't let it go slack. Ever. Regardless of what you hear or think you hear out there." She held his gaze. "Caleb." "Ma'am." "I said I won't let it go slack." The way she said it left no room for further instruction. He nodded. They briefed Pete, who took up his position inside the barn door without comment, wrapping the rope around his forearm in the way of someone who has held things steady before and knows how. Dutch stationed himself at the barn's interior where he could monitor the cattle and the brazier and send word through Thomas, who had materialized from somewhere and refused to be sent away, if anything changed inside. Caleb stepped out into the storm with 60 feet of rope behind him and the western windbreak somewhere ahead in the white. He found the first failed post by walking into it, not gracefully. His left shoulder hit the tilted timber with enough force to stagger him sideways, which would have been bad except that he'd already spread his footing in anticipation of exactly this kind of sudden contact, and he got his balance back before the wind had a chance to make a decision about him. He got both hands on the post and felt the problem immediately. The ground around its base had heaved. The freeze-thaw cycling of the past 48 hours, temperatures fluctuating around the critical threshold at ground level, had worked at the packed earth until the post had lost its foundation. The timber itself was intact. The hole it was supposed to sit in was not. The second and third posts in the section had the same problem, in varying degrees. The third was the worst. Fully free of its base, held upright only by its connection to the adjacent crosspiece, swaying in the gusts with a deliberate pendulum quality that meant it was coming down sometime in the next few hours regardless. Caleb assessed this in approximately 90 seconds, crouching against the base of the second post to get some shelter from the wind, and worked out what was possible. Full repair was not possible. He didn't have the materials or the time or the ground conditions. Driving posts back into heaved, semi-frozen earth in a blizzard was a project for different weather. What was possible was stabilization, using the remaining crosspiece material and the hardware he'd brought in his coat pockets as a precaution, because he'd been thinking about this section for 3 days and known it was the vulnerability, to create a temporary lateral support that would hold the section upright until the storm broke. It was not elegant engineering. It was the kind of solution you arrive at when elegant engineering has run out of time. He started with the third post, the worst one, because if that one came down before he could brace it, the work on the others was meaningless. He got the crosspiece hardware out of his coat pocket and discovered that his hands, despite the gloves, were functioning at about 60%. The cold had gotten into the joints in the way it does after sustained exposure, making the fine motor work slow and unreliable. He dropped a bolt, and it vanished into the snow at his feet, and was simply gone, absorbed by the white, and he spent a moment very specifically not thinking about how many bolts he had left. He had enough. He worked. The wind was the consistent enemy. It was not trying to kill him. It didn't have intentions, but it functioned as though it did, hitting him from angles that made the work physically difficult, pushing at the timber he was trying to brace at the precise moments he needed it still. He learned to work in the gaps between gusts, which were maybe 4 seconds long, doing as much as he could in each gap, and then holding position and waiting for the next one. He thought about Thomas, about the way the boy had held the lantern for 3 straight hours the night before without complaint, about the 4-year-old who'd decided that scared and okay could coexist and found that satisfactory, about Alara standing at the barn door in this same wind with 60 feet of rope in her hands, not letting it go slack. He finished the third post brace and moved to the second. At some point, he'd lost precise track of time, which happened in whiteout conditions. The sensory deprivation erased the normal markers. He felt 2 quick vibrations on the rope at his waist. Not his signal. His signal was 2 hard pulls from him outward. This was from the barn end. A check. "Are you there?" He answered with 1 pull. "Still here." A pause. then one pull back from the barn end. Something about that exchange, the simplicity of it, the fact that it worked, the fact that there was someone on the other end of the rope paying attention, steadied him in a way he hadn't expected to need steadying. He moved to the second post. The brace on the second post was faster because it was less damaged and because his hands, paradoxically, had gone past the worst of the cold into a kind of numb functionality, not feeling much, but moving. He got the lateral support in place and tested it with his body weight, leaning against the section and feeling for give. Not perfect, not going to make any engineer proud, but it was going to hold through the night, which was what mattered. The first post was the simplest repair. He was done in 7 minutes. He crouched in the snow behind the section and looked at what he'd built, and felt the wind doing its best against the bracing and watched the bracing not move, and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction. Satisfaction required warmth and rest and maybe something to drink, but was adjacent to it. The exhausted recognition of a thing done well enough under conditions that argued against it. He gave 2 hard pulls on the rope. The line went taut immediately, and he let it guide him back. Elara was at the barn door when he came out of the white. She had the rope wrapped around both forearms, and her feet set, and her face showed the wind and the cold and the sustained effort of standing against both. And when he came close enough to see her expression clearly, he saw something he hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, but the dropping away of a tension that had been absolute. She didn't say anything. She started unwrapping the rope from her arms. He looked at her hands when she'd gotten the rope free. The rope had cut into her palms through the gloves. Not badly, but visibly, red lines that would bruise and stiffen by morning. "Let me see," he said. "I'm fine." Elara. She looked up at him. The use of her first name was unusual enough to register. She held out her hands and let him look. "You held it hard," he said. "I said I wouldn't let it go slack." "I know." He looked at her palms for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the medical assessment. "Thank you." She pulled her hands back, not roughly. "Did it hold?" "For now. It needs proper repair when the storm breaks, but it'll get through the night." She nodded. She looked at the rope in her hands, then coiled it with the automatic efficiency of someone who puts things away properly, even when they're exhausted, especially when they're exhausted. "Dutch is better," she said. The cough settled some. "Pete is complaining about his hands, which means he's fine. He only complains when he's fine, never when he's actually hurting." "Thomas?" Asleep on the horse blankets again, Sam covered him. A brief pause. "Your boy is something, Caleb." The use of his name, plain, without the formal address she'd maintained for weeks, sat between them in a way neither of them commented on. "He's more than I deserve," Caleb said, and meant it in the complicated way of a parent who knows their children are better than they are and finds that fact both humbling and motivating. Elara looked at him with the directness that was fundamental to her and said, "Don't say things like that." "Like what?" "Like you don't deserve them. You came however many miles in a dying wagon in winter with 2 children and nowhere to go because you'd made a promise to a dead woman. That's not a man who doesn't deserve his kids." Caleb didn't have a response to that. Nobody had said anything like it to him in a year. He'd been too busy surviving to notice how much he'd needed someone to say it, and now that someone had, he found he didn't know what to do with it. He looked at the barn floor, then at the cattle, then at the small shape of his son sleeping under a blanket in the corner. "I should check the temperature log," he said finally, which was not a response to what she'd said, and they both knew it, and she let it go. The third night of the storm was the quietest of the 3, which was not the same as calm. The wind dropped marginally, from violent to merely brutal, and the snow continued with the patient permanence of a thing that has no reason to stop. The temperature inside the barn held at 15 degrees, just enough, the brazier burning at its lowest viable setting, while Pete watched it with the focused attention he gave to things he'd decided to take personally. Caleb dozed for 2 hours sitting against the barn wall, woke with his neck aching and his hands stiff, and the immediate awareness, the awareness that had replaced normal waking since Margaret died, of where his children were. Thomas was 3 feet away, still under the blanket. He could hear Nora in the main house because the wind had dropped enough that sounds carried differently. He checked the temperature log. recorded the reading, sat for a moment in the lantern light with the log in his hands, and looked at the numbers he'd accumulated over the past months. All the readings, all the wind records, all the behavioral notes on the cattle, the hay consumption figures, the pipe temperature comparisons. It was a record of a winter being survived. Dutch was awake across the barn, sitting with his back against a post, watching the cattle with the loose attention of someone too tired to be fully alert, but too responsible to fully sleep. "Thornridge," Dutch said, quietly so as not to wake Thomas. Caleb looked up. "Yeah." "That windbreak." Dutch paused. "I didn't think it was going to work." "I know. I told 3 people at the feed store it wasn't going to work." He picked at a piece of straw. "I was pretty sure." "You raised a fair objection. The Eastern Post Gap was exactly the problem you predicted." "I was still mostly wrong." Caleb looked at him. Dutch was not a man who said things like that. The statement had cost something, and they both knew it, and treating it as a small thing would have been wrong. "The entrance angle was my mistake," Caleb said. "You flagged the sightline issue, and I didn't weight it enough. That's on me." Dutch was quiet for a moment. Even, Caleb agreed. The 4th morning arrived with the storm still present but diminished. A retreating force rather than an advancing one, the wind pulling back, the snow thinning from wall to curtain to the kind of manageable fall that felt almost gentle after what had come before. The temperature outside, when Caleb made the crossing to check the windbreak repair in proper daylight, was still severe. But the light was clear and directional, the horizon visible, and the sky above the ridge carried the thin, washed quality of a system that had spent most of what it had. The windbreak repair had held, every section of it. He stood in the snow and looked at it, at the bracing he'd built in a whiteout on numb hands with a limited supply of hardware, and allowed himself 30 seconds of simply looking at it before he went back to work. When he came back into the barn, Pete was standing at the entrance, looking out at the white landscape with the expression of a man seeing something familiar from a new angle. "Other ranches," Pete said. "Crow's east pasture. You can see it from the ridge on a clear day. I don't like the look of what that snow's doing over there." Caleb came to stand beside him. Even from here, even at this distance, the distribution pattern was wrong. The kind of drifting that happened when structures had failed and the snow was reorganizing itself into the space where something solid used to be. "He's going to have losses," Pete said. Not with satisfaction, just with the flat assessment of an old man who's seen winters before. "Probably," Caleb said. "He's got 15 times the cattle we do." "I know." Pete turned and looked at the barn interior, at the cattle alive and standing, at the water moving through the trough, at the hay supply intact, at the calf asleep against her mother in the far stall. "You know what I thought first week you were here?" Pete said. "I have a reasonable guess. I thought—" The old man stopped, rearranged whatever he was going to say. "I thought you were going to be another person who came through and made things harder to deal with after they left. We get that sometimes. People with ideas." He looked back at the barn. "But you stayed in it. Didn't have anywhere else to be," Caleb said. Pete looked at him sideways, reading whether that was self-deprecation or truth. "Both," Caleb said. Pete made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh Caleb had heard from him. He went back to tending the brazier, and Caleb went to start the morning check, and outside the storm finished what it had to say and went wherever storms go when they're done. The silence, when it came, was enormous. After days of wind, the quiet had a weight and a texture that pressed against the ears. Nora noticed it first. She came running from the main house the moment she understood what it meant, sliding through the barn door in her coat and boots, stopping in the middle of the floor and tilting her head back as though listening for something. "It stopped," she said. "It stopped," Caleb confirmed. She processed this. Then she went directly to Button's stall and began her examination of the calf with the thoroughness of someone who has important responsibilities. Thomas came in behind her, slower, and went to stand at the barn entrance, looking out at the landscape of snow that had replaced the world. His face was complex in the way that 9-year-old faces sometimes are when the child is processing something that doesn't have a simple category. "Pa," he said. "Yeah." We made it. Caleb came to stand beside his son and looked out at the white world, at the windbreak standing, at the marker posts still in their positions, at the track his own feet had made in the snow on the last crossing, already softening at the edges. We made it, he said. Elara appeared in the barn doorway beside them. She had changed from the clothes she'd worn through the storm, and her hair was down, which Caleb had not seen before, and she stood looking at the property, at everything still standing, at the systems that it held, with an expression he would think about later and still not have precise words for. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter and more permanent than either. She looked at Caleb. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of conversation. What was broken in Black Ridge Hollow, the structures, the systems, the years of accumulated difficulty, had not been fixed by the storm. Storms don't fix things. They only reveal what was worth keeping, and what was worth keeping, it turned out, was most of it. The cattle were alive. The calf was alive. The water ran. The hay would last. And somewhere out past the ridge, the valley was already waking up to count its losses, and would soon start looking toward the one ranch that hadn't suffered them. The first visitor arrived 2 days after the storm ended. Not Crow. Someone smaller. A rancher named Aldous Webb, who ran a modest spread 3 miles east and had lost 11 cattle to the storm, which represented roughly a third of what he owned. He came on horseback, moving slowly through the broken snow, and when he reached Black Ridge Hollow, he sat on his horse at the entrance for a moment and just looked at the property, the way a man looks at something that contradicts what he thought he knew. Pete saw him first and came to get Caleb without explanation, just appeared at the barn door and said, "Someone's here," with the tone of a man who understands the significance of the visit without being able to articulate it precisely. Webb was maybe 55, weathered in the specific way of men who work outside in Montana, with a face that had given up on expressions that required effort. He climbed down from his horse and shook Caleb's hand with the grip of someone who hadn't decided yet what he thought of you, but was willing to be persuaded. "Your barn's standing," Webb said. Not accusatory, just observational, with an undercurrent of something that might have been wonder. "Yes, sir." "Lost any cattle?" "No." Webb looked at the windbreak, at the barn, at the water trough that was still flowing while every trough in his own spread had frozen solid and cracked the lining. "I heard about the windbreak design. People have been talking." "People talk," Caleb said. "They're saying you put it at a distance from the structures, that you calculated the drift zone deliberately." "That's right." Webb was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man swallowing something that didn't go down easy. "I've been running cattle in this valley for 22 years, he said. "My father ran cattle here before me. We never lost a winter the way we lost this one." He looked at Caleb directly. "What would it take for you to come look at my spread? Tell me what I've been doing wrong." Caleb glanced back at the ranch, at Elara, who had come to stand in the doorway of the main house and was watching this conversation with the carefully neutral expression she used when she was paying close attention. She gave him nothing. This was his call to make. "I can come Thursday," Caleb said, "if the roads allow." Webb nodded. He didn't say thank you. It wasn't that kind of exchange. He mounted back up and rode out, and that was that. Except it wasn't, because Webb talked to people the way people do in small communities where information is a form of currency, and by the following week there were 3 more requests, and by the end of the month there were 7, and Caleb was spending 2 days a week riding out to neighboring properties and doing exactly what he'd done at Black Ridge Hollow, walking the land, reading the structures, identifying what had failed and why, and what could be done about it before next winter arrived. He didn't charge for it. That was Elara's suggestion, which surprised him. "You could," she said. "People would pay." "I know. But if I charge for it now, it becomes a transaction. People listen to transactions differently than they listen to help." He was repairing the windbreak's east section properly. The bolt-by-bolt reckoning of everything he'd done in a hurry during the storm, done right this time with adequate light and functional hands. "Let them owe me nothing. They'll remember what works." Elara was quiet for a moment. That's either very smart or very naive. Might be both. She handed him a bolt without being asked because she'd been watching what he was doing long enough to know what he needed next. My husband would have charged, she said, and he would have been right, financially. Probably. But he also would have done it alone. She looked at the bolt in her hand before she gave it to him. He didn't like being in debt to anyone, not even the good kind of debt. Caleb took the bolt. What kind is that? The kind where someone helped you and you want to return it, where the help cost them something and they gave it anyway. She looked out at the valley, at the snow still thick on the ground, at the other ranches visible in the middle distance, their winter damage apparent even from here. That kind of debt makes people neighbors instead of strangers. He didn't say anything. He went back to work. But the thought stayed with him, turned over in his mind during the quiet parts of the work, and he kept arriving at the same conclusion. She was right. She was right in a way he hadn't had language for before, and now that she'd said it, he couldn't unsay it. Gideon Crow came on a Wednesday, which was specific enough that Caleb suspected it was deliberate. Midweek, not the weekend visit of a social call, not the Monday urgency of someone in crisis. A Wednesday, the workday that said this is business and I'm treating it as such. He came alone again, same as the second visit. He rode through the gate and dismounted and stood looking at Blackridge Hollow for a long time before Caleb went out to meet him. The property had changed visibly since Crow's last visit. Not dramatically. It was still the same buildings, same land, but there was a quality of intention to it now that hadn't been as apparent before. The windbreak stood properly repaired, its lines clean. The barn's north face showed the reinforcement work. The approach to the entrance was clearly redesigned, the guide rail low and functional. The marker posts still stood at their 10-foot intervals, their red cloth strips faded by the storm, but intact. Crow looked at all of it. He took his time. "You didn't lose any cattle," he said when Caleb reached him. "No, sir. I lost 43. He said it the way a man says a number that cost him something. Flat, factual. No performance of grief, but real weight behind it. 43 animals out of my best winter herd. My east barn took damage I'm still assessing. 2 of my hands got frostbite. 1 lost 2 toes." He paused. 40 years of my family's experience in this valley, and the man who'd been here 3 months came through better than I did. Caleb didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be the wrong thing. Crow looked at the windbreak. "I had a man tell me you built that at a distance from the structures on purpose, that you put the drift zone in open space. Yes?" I told him he'd misunderstood. "I know," Caleb said. "You told me it wasn't how windbreaks worked." "It isn't, traditionally." Crow's jaw moved slightly. "But your tradition held and mine didn't, so I'm reconsidering my position on tradition." He looked at Caleb directly. "I want to rebuild my east barn approach. I want a proper windbreak on the north pasture. And I want to know what you know about waterline insulation, because I lost 2 troughs and a main line this winter." He paused. "I'm asking for your help." It was clearly not a sentence that came easily to Gideon Crow. The bones of his pride were visible underneath it. The effort it had required, the adjustment in his understanding of himself that the asking represented. Caleb thought about the 2 visits, the deliberate skepticism, structural vulnerabilities, the implication that Alara should sell before a tinker's barn theories delayed the inevitable. He thought about all of that, and then he thought about 43 dead cattle and a man who'd lost toes, and the thinking didn't take long. "I can come out next week," Caleb said. "We can walk the property." Crow looked at him. "You're not going to make me work for that." "No." "Why not?" Caleb shrugged slightly. "Because your cattle dying doesn't help anyone, and because you came here and asked honestly." He looked at the man. "That's enough." Crow was quiet for a long moment. The quality of the silence was different from the silences in their previous conversations, less strategic, more real. "I was going to make Alara Whitmore a very good offer," Crow said finally. "This spring. I figured the winter would have taken enough out of her that the pride would have given way to the practical. I know. That offer's off the table." He said it without particular ceremony, as though he was closing an account. "Not because I've gone soft. Because you've made the property worth keeping, and she'd have to be a fool to sell it now, and she's not a fool." He picked up his reins. "I don't buy things I can't improve on." He mounted up. He was almost at the gate when he turned back. Thornridge. He said it in a different register than he'd used before. Not quite respect, or maybe exactly respect, in the vocabulary of a man who'd spent his life having that word come to him rather than going to others. You did good work here. He rode out. Caleb stood in the cold for a moment after the sound of the hooves faded, looking at the gate, at the road beyond it, at the valley stretching out in its winter white. He thought about the man who'd shown up at that gate with a wobbling wagon wheel and two freezing children, and the particular desperation of someone who has run out of options except the next one. He thought about Margaret, about the way she would have found the whole arc of it, Crow's conversion, the neighbors coming for advice, the calf named Button, deeply, privately amusing. She'd had a sense of humor about the world's ironies that he'd never quite matched and had always loved in her. He missed her. He would miss her for the rest of his life, and that was a fact he'd stopped trying to negotiate with. But the missing and the living had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to occupy the same space. Spring came to Black Ridge Hollow in the way Montana spring comes, not gently, not with any of the softness the calendar implies, but as a slow, grudging retreat of winter, day by day, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, while the northern faces held on stubbornly well into April. The ground that emerged from the snow was not romantic. It was churned and gray and carrying the evidence of everything the winter had done, and there was work in it, fencing that needed walking and assessment, drainage channels that needed clearing, the equipment shed roof that had partially lifted in the storm and needed proper repair. The work didn't stop. It changed character, from survival to rebuilding, which was a different kind of effort, but still the daily physical commitment that ranch life required regardless of season. Thomas turned 10 in March. Sam, who apparently tracked these things through some mechanism no one had asked about, appeared at breakfast with a carved wooden horse, rough-hewn, not fine, but accurate in its proportions, and set it on the table in front of the boy without comment. Thomas looked at it for a moment with the expression he got when something hit him deeper than he was prepared to show, and said thank you in a voice that was working harder than usual to stay even. Sam nodded and went back to his eggs. Nora, who felt that birthdays required more ceremony than that, sang something that may or may not have been an actual song and presented Thomas with a drawing she'd made of Button, which was recognizable as a calf, primarily because she'd labeled it Buton in large, uncertain letters across the top. Thomas kept both gifts. Caleb noticed he put them side by side on the shelf above his bunk, which was the shelf he used for things that mattered. The offer came from Alara on an evening in late April, when the light was lasting past 6 o'clock, and the air had finally started carrying the smell of earth instead of cold. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the table that had seen so many late evenings of ledgers and temperature logs and quiet conversations that it had accumulated the feel of a working space, a place where real things got decided. She put a document on the table between them. Caleb looked at it without touching it. "What is this?" he said. "Partnership agreement." She said it with the directness she applied to everything that mattered to her. Equal share of the operation, decisions made jointly, profit split, which means losses split too. I want that understood. Caleb looked at the document, then at Alara. "You don't owe me this," he said. "I know that. I came here with nothing. You gave me a place and work and shelter for my kids. That debt is mine." Caleb. She used his name the way she'd started using it after the storm, naturally, without the formality she'd maintained for weeks. "I've been running this ranch alone for 2 years, not because I'm incapable of accepting help, but because the help that was offered always came with something attached to it." She looked at the document. Crow's help came with a deed transfer. The Valley's sympathy came with the expectation that I'd eventually fail, and they could feel correctly sad about it. She looked up. "What you offered when you came here was work, just work, in exchange for shelter and the chance to prove something." She paused. "I'm offering the same thing back. Work, partnership, in exchange for staying." Caleb looked at his hands on the table. They were different hands than they'd been in November, more scarred, more capable, carrying the record of a winter's work in their texture. He thought about the wagon on the ridge, about the moment he'd seen the ranch below and read its problems from the distance and known he could fix them. About all the things he'd fixed and all the things he'd gotten wrong and had to fix again. About the rope in Alara's hands, wrapped around both forearms, not going slack. "My kids stay," he said. Not a negotiation, just a fact that needed to be part of any arrangement. "Your kids stay," she said, as though it had never been a question. Nora is apparently under the impression that she owns Button, which I've decided to allow on the grounds that I'm not sure who would win that argument otherwise. Something in Caleb's chest moved in a way he hadn't expected and wasn't entirely prepared for. He looked at the table for a moment. "The ranch has problems I haven't fixed yet," he said. "The south pasture drainage is wrong. The equipment shed needs a full roof, not a patch. And I want to redesign the main water system before next winter." "I know about the south pasture. I've known about it for 3 years." She looked at him steadily. "Put it in the work plan." He looked at the partnership agreement. It was handwritten in Alara's precise, controlled script, the handwriting of someone who'd learned to write carefully because what was written down mattered and couldn't be taken back. He picked up the pen she'd left beside it. He signed it. Neither of them made a production of it. Alara took the document and put it in the desk drawer where she kept the ranch's important papers, next to the deed and the original land survey her husband had filed 15 years ago. She came back to the table and poured coffee for both of them, and they sat in the kitchen in the April evening with the light going gold outside the window, and the sounds of the ranch coming through. Pete saying something gruff to Dutch in the yard, the cattle in the distance. Nora's voice somewhere near the barn talking to Button with the earnest monologue she maintained with the calf on a daily basis. "She's going to be a problem," Alara said. "Nora, when it's time to sell that calf." "She'll negotiate," Caleb said. "She's been practicing." "On who?" "Everyone. She got Sam to let her name 2 of the horses last week." Alara looked at him with something that was unmistakably amusement. "Sam let her name his horses." "He didn't stop her. With Sam, that's the same thing." She shook her head slowly, and the amusement stayed on her face longer than she usually allowed things to stay. By summer, the neighboring ranches had started rebuilding using what Caleb had shown them, and the valley looked different. Not dramatically, not in any way a stranger would necessarily notice, but in the small structural details that people who lived there read the way you read a face. Windbreaks repositioned, hay storage elevated, water lines wrapped properly and buried at the right depth. The changes were unglamorous and practical, and they would matter in the next hard winter and the one after that. Caleb rode out every week to check on the progress. He was not a consultant and didn't present himself as one. He was a man who understood broken things, helping other men understand the same, and the distinction mattered to him even if no one else thought much about it. Dutch got better at the work over the summer in the specific way of someone who has stopped resisting and started listening. He would never entirely stop pushing back on new ideas. That was his nature, and Caleb had come to understand that Dutch's resistance wasn't obstruction, but its own form of quality control, the kind of friction that sometimes caught real errors. He'd been right about the sightline issue. He'd been right about other things that Caleb had initially disagreed with and later acknowledged. A man who pushes back intelligently is worth more than 10 men who only agree. Pete's hands never fully recovered from the winter. He worked at about 80% of his former capacity and compensated with 60 years of accumulated knowledge, which meant he was still the most efficient person on the property by a significant margin. He never said another word about thinking Caleb was full of it. He didn't have to. He showed up every morning and did the work, and that was Pete's version of everything that needed to be said. Sam remained Sam, quiet, watchful, competent in ways that only became apparent when something was wrong, because when things were right, he was simply part of the background doing his work. Thomas spent more time with him than with anyone except Caleb, and Caleb watched his son develop a way of moving through the ranch, observant, unhurried, paying attention to what the animals and the land were telling him. That was clearly Sam's influence and something Caleb was grateful for in a way he never quite found the right words to express. He tried once, came to Sam directly and started saying something about it. Sam listened, then said, "He's a good kid, easy to work with," and went back to what he was doing. That was Sam's version of "you're welcome," and Caleb accepted it. In the fall, before the cold returned, Caleb walked the property alone one evening in the low amber light that came off the ridge in late October. He walked the windbreak, checking each post, reading the stability of each section the way he'd read the stability of that dying wagon wheel back in November. Not with anxiety, but with the practical attention of someone who knows that everything requires maintenance, that nothing stays fixed without continued care. The ranch was not perfect. It would never be perfect. The south pasture drainage was improved but not fully solved. That was a project for spring, requiring a dry stretch and specific equipment. The equipment shed roof was solid, but he wanted to reinforce one section of the joinery before winter. There were always things. There would always be things. That used to feel like failure to him, the persistent incompleteness of maintenance, the way the list never went to zero. He'd spent years being impatient with it, with structures and systems that needed continuous attention, with the relentlessness of a world that kept presenting new problems the moment you solved the old ones. He learned something different here. The list never going to zero wasn't failure. It was just the nature of keeping something alive. You didn't fix things once and walk away. You fixed them, and then you kept fixing them. And that repetition wasn't a sign that the first fix didn't work. It was the work itself. The ongoing, imperfect, necessary work. He stopped at the top of the East Ridge, the same ridge where he'd first seen Black Ridge Hollow below, the dying wagon behind him, 2 children under 3 blankets, nowhere else to go. He looked down at the ranch in the October light. The smoke from the kitchen chimney was going. The barn sat at the same wrong angle it had always sat at. That was a generational mistake too large to correct without rebuilding from the ground up. And the ground they stood on was not available for that, so they managed it, worked with it, positioned everything else around it so that the flaw became a manageable factor instead of a fatal one. It occurred to him that that was probably true of more things than barns. Below, the ranch kitchen light came on. He could see Nora's shape at the window for a moment. She had a habit of looking out the window at nothing in particular while she waited for things to happen, and he recognized it because he did the same thing and had wondered where she'd gotten it, and had recently understood the answer. He started back down the ridge. Winter would come again. It always did. It would be different from the last one in the specific ways that seasons are always different, and it would bring problems they hadn't anticipated because that was also the nature of it. He would make mistakes. Alara would catch some of them before they mattered and miss others. Dutch would push back on ideas that deserved to be pushed back on, and some that didn't. Pete's hands would ache in the cold. Sam would watch quietly and know things before anyone else did, and say them in as few words as possible. They had not defeated winter. That was not a thing that happened. Winter was not something you defeated. It was something you learned, season by season, failure by failure, correction by correction, until your understanding of it was deep enough that you could stand in its path without being destroyed. Thomas met him at the barn door. The boy had grown 2 inches since November and still hadn't adjusted to it, moving with the slight uncertainty of someone whose body has recently renegotiated its terms. Sam says the north pasture fence has a section that needs checking before the ground freezes, Thomas said. I saw it this afternoon. I'll get to it tomorrow. Thomas nodded. Then, Pa. Yeah. The boy looked at him with the directness that was his mother's trait living on in a different face. Are we staying? Caleb looked at the ranch, at the kitchen window where Nora's shape had moved away from the glass, at the barn where the work waited, always waited, the list that never went to zero. Yeah, he said, we're staying. Thomas absorbed this with the economy of a boy who'd learned not to show how much he needed certain answers. He turned back toward the barn. South pasture drainage, he said as he went. Sam has some ideas about it. Tell him I want to hear them, Caleb said. He stood for another moment in the October air looking at the property that was now half his in writing and had been entirely his in effort since the first morning he'd picked up a spade in frozen ground and started to fix what was broken. The forgotten ranch. The place nobody expected to survive. Still here.